This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 5, Writing, Literacy, and Society. In this lesson, we'll talk about the differences between literate and oral cultures. To begin, we'll note that literacy, of course, hasn't been a skill that humanity has had since from the beginning. Cultures in the past were primarily oral cultures. And there are cultures today which continue to exist without a writing system. We call cultures which don't use a form of writing system an oral culture. In this lesson, what we'll talk about is how an oral society is actually able to function without using a writing system. We'll talk about what kinds of advantages that a writing system can provide for a literate society when in comparison to an oral society. We'll also talk about a belief which many scholars hold, which is that alphabets are a kind of superior writing system. So we'll discuss this conclusion that some people have come to, and how the author of our textbook, Richard Sproat, has come to criticize it. So to start with, we'll define what we mean by a literate culture. So, of course, a literate culture is a culture which uses writing to encode its information. So this kind of information would be things like legal codes and histories, culture works like literature, all the reasons that we've discussed in the previous lessons for this module. In addition to this idea of a literate culture, we can also talk about something that we can call a literate society. What Sproat calls a literate society is a society for which a writing system exists. Now, it's important to note that a literate society does not necessarily mean that the entire of society is literate, or even that most members of the society are literate. Rather that just there is a writing system that does exist and some individuals use it. So to think of an example of a society that fits this kind of pattern, we can think about medieval Europe. So in medieval Europe, the most people were not literate. However, there was reading and writing going on, usually restricted to academics and people in monasteries. And that writing was usually done in Latin. For this reason, we can say that medieval Europe is a literate society. Writing was very important for it to function, but most members were not literate. So a literate society does not necessarily mean that all individuals are literate. However, we also have cultures which don't use literacy at all, and even to the present day. And we call these cultures oral cultures. So in lieu of using a writing system to record historical records or to record codes of law, these are cultures which transmit information through speech and recitation. And these cultures usually involve individuals who are able to memorize very large sayings and very large stories in a way that is very impressive, and to a degree that they can actually create a functioning law code and a functioning historical record. So oral cultures are still able to function without a literate culture very well, but as we'll be discussing in this lesson, there are some important differences from how they are able to record their histories and use their law codes. So to kind of illustrate this culture, which I am taking from our course's textbook, I'll talk about the Gonja people of northern Ghana. And the Gonja people are an example of an oral culture. And because of this, they use an oral historical record to determine the rights of political succession. They have a story about their chief and their history, and they use this record to actually determine who is able to become the next chief. So this is how the legal system works. And Ghana, like many other parts of Africa, was colonized by the British in the late 19th century. And what that means for us is that we see two records or two incidences where the British came into contact with the Gonja people and where the British were able to write down what the oral history looked like at two different points in time. So we'll look at an example of the Gonja's oral history in the early 1900s, and then we'll look at the same history again in the 1960s, and we'll see what happened in those intervening 60 years. So in the early 1900s, what we see in the record is that the history talks about a chief named Dewara Jakpa, who had conquered territory in northern Ghana and had proclaimed himself chief of that area. And since he was the chief, his sons were installed as the rulers of the territorial divisions within Jakpa's territory. And it's these 7 sons who are the rulers of these territorial divisions who are eligible for the paramountcy. They are eligible to become chiefs themselves. So it is so this kind of record here was maintained through the Gonja people's recitated histories. And that's why it was so important, because this history determines who is and who is not eligible to become the next chief. So the Gonja people were contacted again later in the 1960s by the same British colonial administration, but by then the story had changed. So the story continued to talk about the chief Dewar Jakpa, who had conquered the same area of territory, but then the oral history said that he installed his 5 sons as ruler of territorial divisions, and that these 5 sons are eligible for the paramountcy. So you might be wondering, why did the history change? What happened to these other 2 sons, and why did the historical record change in this instance? Well, what we can see is that 2 of Jakpa's sons in these 60 years became ineligible for the paramountcy. One of the sons' territorial divisions was incorporated into the administration of another tribe, and another son was put under a different administration by the British. So politically, the effect of this is that these 2 sons were no longer eligible for tribal membership. So in other words, we can say that for all intents and purposes, Jakpa has 5 sons. And so it's in these 60 intervening years that these 2 sons had become ineligible. So why was it that the historical record changed here? Why couldn't we say that there were 7 sons and then 2 became ineligible? Well, the key thing about an oral history, the key thing to note, is that the oral histories are usually only relevant to the present day. They only contain information that are relevant for current political practices. They leave out the kind of minutia that aren't really needed to know about. So it's important that when we kind of look at these oral histories, they're locked to the here and now, and they convey the perspective of our current society on past society. So that's why I kind of translated this this oral record as being, for all intents and purposes, Dewar Jakpa had 5 sons. Now, this contrasts with the kind of history that can be maintained by a literate culture. So in a literate culture, a historical individual is able to encode their particular perspective in a way that does not change over time and does not necessarily have to be relevant to the here and now. And so for this reason, we could argue that literate cultures are able to think more critically about what their past kind of looks like. So it's because that these written documents don't change over time that gives these literate cultures a kind of advantage. Now, it's important to emphasize at this point that just because literate cultures are able to have this kind of advantage, that does not mean that oral histories are inferior. In fact, they are able to convey the same kind of complexity that a literate culture kind of can. It's just that it is much more difficult for an oral history to move away from the here and now, from the present. So that's kind of a difference between oral and literate histories. So, also when we're talking about literacy, we've seen that literacy is something that was recognized as important in ancient Greece. So ancient Greece is often seen as an example of how a society became advanced, possibly because of literacy. And this was recognized by the Greeks at the time. Aristotle, for example, identified the aspects of society for which literacy is important. Namely, the ones that he identified were money-making, household management, instruction, and civic activities. And you can see that these four functions are fairly similar to the kinds that we discussed at the beginning of this module. So even very early on in history, we can see the importance of literacy being recognized. Now, however, this importance of literacy to ancient Greek society might be partially overstated. Some scholars have even argued that it is that literacy was the sole factor which made ancient Greece an advanced early society. And some even argue that it's not just the use of a writing system in general, but specifically that they're using an alphabet as opposed to a syllabary or a logography. So we see this argument by Goody in The Domestication of the Savage Mind, who argues that the ancient Greeks had because they used an alphabet, that required Greeks to develop a skill of phonological awareness. So this is a skill we covered a little bit earlier when we were talking about writing systems, how learning how to use an alphabet requires you to break up words into their component sounds. And this is not a skill that people are born with. It's something that people have to be taught. It's a kind of analytic skill. And Goody argues that this analytic skill actually led to an increase in general analytic ability. So because Greeks were analyzing the way they were speaking more closely, they analyzed a way that they were doing everything in general. So he argues that it is this analytic ability which led to Greek advancements in philosophy and democratic ideals. And some even go farther than Goody and argue that Western cultures are superior to others because they use alphabetic systems. So these are points which Sproat comes to criticize in the textbook that we're using for this course. So here's why Sproat actually criticizes these claims from Goody and others. So first of all, one of which is that ancient Greece is not really as advanced as we would like to, or was not as democratic as we would like to think it is. Sproat mentions that many individuals in ancient Greece actually weren't able to vote. The franchise was extremely restricted, so they didn't really have the kind of democratic ideals that we do today in many democracies. Secondly, that Sproat also notes from a technical point of view, when talking about the writing system, that in fact alphabets aren't the only writing systems where you need to have a kind of phonological awareness. When we were discussing the syllabaries in our unit on writing systems, we can notice that a lot of writing systems actually have units which require a certain degree of phonological awareness. The Japanese syllabary has an example. Japanese has some symbols for that represent single sounds, not just syllables. So it's not the case that an alphabet is the only way to have phonological awareness. So it can't be the case that ancient Greek was the only society with this purported advantage. And finally, as we'll see later in this module, we'll see that the type of writing system that is used in a society, whether that is a syllabary, alphabet, or logography, does not correlate with cultural advancement, or economic factors, or the level of literacy that is actually attained in a society. So, so these are key things to keep in mind. Nonetheless, we should also keep in mind that this idea that an alphabet is a kind of superior writing system is a very popular one. And it's very often the case that a society or a country will aim to increase its literacy by developing an alphabet. So we'll study examples of actually writing system reforms and see how much that kind of reform actually helps, if at all. Yeah. So although I've kind of, Sprout has kind of criticized the fact that the use of an alphabet wasn't really the key for the advancements attributed to ancient Greece, there are some benefits of writing that we can identify, especially when compared to oral cultures. So one of which is the representation of information in 2 dimensions, and the formation of things like tables. So while Goody and others may not be correct, there are advantages of writing. When we think about speech, we can say that speech is basically a one-dimensional thing. So all speech really is the change in the way that someone speaks over time. So in that sense, it's just one-dimensional. But text is 2-dimensional. We can not only write things from left to right, but we can also write things from the top down. And this allows us to create things like lists and tables. And we can see that this is a kind of, if we look at the archaeological record, we can see that this kind of this idea is a very, very old one. We can see even very ancient and primitive cuneiform tablets were already using kind of table-like arrangements of things. We can see one in this picture right here. Now, why is it important for a table or why is a 2-dimensional representation of information important? Well, we could argue that it's when we arrange information into a table, we are arranging things that are similar to each other in columns and rows. And so all of these things in columns and rows has something abstract, which is in common with each other. So it might be the case that it's these tabular systems which are allowing us to think about things more abstractly and to think about ways to categorize and taxonomize things. So it might be the case that this is that actually some archaeologists have even argued that using this kind of tabular representation of information was important for the development of early writing systems. So this is a key thing to keep in mind when we're talking about an advantage that writing has in comparison to speech. And another advantage that writing has in comparison to speech is that writing is very portable. And so what I mean by portable is that it can easily spread through space and time. And we noticed that over the course of archaeological evidence and over the course of history is that the way that the material that writing is used on has been getting progressively lighter. So we've seen that stone carvings have eventually given way to clay tablets, and then following that, the development of using very thin sheets of light material like paper and papyrus. And we could even argue that this is even lighter today using electronic media to represent information. So in this way, writing is becoming physically less and less heavy and much easier to transport around. So it becomes very easy to move a lot of information around in this way. And additionally, writing is also portable through time. So writing lasts much longer than a person's lifetime, than a person's memory. So a person can write down a document about the things that they're thinking about, and that can allow them to basically preserve the thoughts the way that they've formulated for hundreds of years, even after they've died. So in this way, writing is also portable throughout time as well. And if we think about the current developments in electronic writing and representing information digitally and with text, this information is extremely portable. We can send information across the entire world almost instantaneously, and we can store huge amounts of information in very small spaces. And that's a kind of portability that we just don't get with speech. So this is another major advantage of writing. So to conclude this, this lesson, it's important to emphasize that although literacy is a very important skill, and although writing is a very significant technology, a society does not need literacy to function. And we saw this with the example of the Gonja people. However, writing systems are very significant for a literate society. Yes. Also, we've discussed how oral histories are kind of limited in the way that they're locked to the here and now. So although individuals in oral societies can memorize very elaborate histories, these histories are usually only relevant to themselves and the people that they're talking to. They don't really preserve thoughts that might not be relevant to the here and now. So because they're limited in this way, we might be able to argue that a written history might be have an advantage. We've also talked about the other advantages that writing have, and criticized some arguments, some other arguments which might not be as correct. So we've talked about how people argued that writing, or specifically the use of an alphabet, led to analytic thinking in ancient Greece. We presented some information as to why that might not really be the case. But nonetheless, we do see that there are instances where writing is advantageous. So representing data used in 2 dimensions could possibly lead us to thinking about information more categorically and in ways that are more abstract. And also, writing in this also has the advantage of being more portable. We're able to store much larger amounts of information in a very small space, and that allows us to move it around very easily and to persist long after, even long after the individual who has written that text has died. So we can see that writing is clearly a very significant invention, and why the ability of literacy is so significant to be able to use this information.